Hey guys, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here. Joanna O'Connell, VP Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and I'm here to talk a bit about this sort of stew of forces that are going on right now that are really helping to shape, I think, the go forward future of omnichannel advertising. So I want to start with this to get everybody's attention. I think it's sort of accepted conventional wisdom that people hate advertising. And this has probably showed up in some creative agencies, whiteboarding session. But I think we all think it, and I understand why we all think it. It's conventional wisdom for a reason. But the reality is that advertising does in fact have value, and it has value not just for brands. Of course, advertisers use advertising to generate awareness, intent, sales, and loyalty. We know this, right? We all either work for brands or have been at brands in this advertising environment. But publishers, of course, are a big part of this contract as well. Publishers use ad revenue to fund content creation and also to help subsidize free or low-cost access to that content. So the advertising contract absolutely also includes publishers and value for publishers. But thirdly, the advertising contract includes value for consumers. And consumers, although again, we all love to hate on advertising, can use it to get access to the content we were talking about, but also to learn, laugh, and buy. And again, if we're honest with ourselves, we all know that we've had bad advertising experiences, and we've also had really great advertising experiences. So I'm going to just, for a second, maybe level set when we're talking about this idea of omnichannel, because it's going to come up a bunch, what it is that we're talking about. And really, to me, it's sort of an aperture question. So there is omnichannel in the context, the largest context, where you're really talking about any possible touch point and really all of the parts in between when you're thinking about an ecosystem that a brand is developing. And when I say brand, I mean an organization is developing. So this is not just about marketing per se. Within that aperture is the aperture of omnichannel marketing, where you're talking about paid stuff, sure, but you're also talking about owned environments and earned media and the like. So it's that aperture. You go one level below that to the aperture of advertising, which is to say paid media, and that's really what we're talking about today, the aperture of omnichannel advertising, that is paid media. And that is where our little star lives. Okay, so why do we even care about this idea of omnichannel advertising? Well, if you think about the traditional model, and this is the model I grew up in certainly, and I'm sure a lot of you did too, we bought channels very individually in a siloed way, and we did it very manually, where you're sending off the insertion order through email and you're building things in spreadsheets. And that is not to say that there isn't a lot of that stuff that still happens today, but that does not mean that that's the optimum way to do things. So, if you think about the operational inefficiency that's baked into that kind of approach, it's very real, it's very material. You also have some limitations from a performance standpoint because things are operating really individually, and that means that your sort of understanding of what's happening and your ability to make changes is quite individualized, for example, by channel. But I think importantly, and a thing that we had not traditionally talked all that much about, is that the experience for a consumer may not be all that great either when it feels as though it is very disconnected, or it is either way too light, like I saw your ad once and never again, so who the heck are you? Or way too heavy, like I'm seeing your ads 100 times a day across every particular medium that I happen to interact with. Those are not good experiences for consumers. So this idea of the traditional approach of advertising being multi-channel and manual, frankly, we believe is suboptimal. So when we talk about this idea of omnichannel, then what do we mean philosophically? So we're really talking about an approach that is much more connected, right? So sequenced across channels, connected, relevant, consistent with the customer stage in their life cycle. In other words, really much more customer-centric rather than, say, channel-centric. Much more coordinated, which is to say purposefully designed rather than simply just running a bunch of stuff all at the same time. And much more complete, which is to say being in the places that consumers are, kind of where they need you and when they need you. So that kind of fundamentally is what we mean when we're talking about this idea of omnichannel. Okay, so is it really better? This is a question I've been asking myself for a long time because I'm a big believer in the idea of this. And so we actually sort of set out to test the hypothesis that a more omnichannel approach to advertising was in fact better. And by using Forrester's total economic impact, or TEI, model, I worked with some of the TEI folks inside of Forrester, and this is for syndicated research. I did this just for our research at Forrester. We actually interviewed some customers that had moved to a more kind of streamlined, consolidated, centralized omnichannel approach, and more technology driven. And we interviewed them and crunched a bunch of numbers and basically proved, yes, in fact, moving from a traditional manual multi-channel siloed approach to a more omni-channel approach is in fact an ROI positive exercise, which is to say it is worth the effort to make this kind of your new paradigm. And again, this is just sort of classic Forrester syndicated research. It's in our omnichannel advertising playbook. So we proved it, which was very exciting for me. And of course, that sounds amazing, right? Like, of course, that's what we all want. We want to deliver great experiences to consumers. We want to be operationally efficient. We want to have great performance. We want to live the omnichannel dream, of course. But we're at a weird time in advertising right now, especially in digital advertising. So I'm just gonna, who's had this experience? I'm gonna pause and share this cartoon with you. And maybe you've seen this cartoon before. I can't help it. I think it's just the best, most perfect encapsulation of all of the things that have kind of gone wrong in the digital advertising ecosystem over the last 25 years, certainly the last 10 years or so, where you have, you know, somebody's holiday being ruined by a retargeting campaign that was aggressive and intrusive and also badly executed. So everything about this is bad. And the reality is we all know that these are the kinds of things that do in fact happen. This is not an uncommon experience for consumers to have, including us, the human beings that are in the ad tech and advertising industry, but also are consumers ourselves. So what we would argue is that the balance, we talked about that kind of contract, that relationship among advertisers, publishers, and consumers, the balance of the needs and value creation among those three constituencies has been lost. And the group that seems to be the sort of most obviously unhappy with how advertising is working right now, and very rightly so, is consumers themselves. The balance has been lost in what we call the age of the customer. And the age of the customer is this time we find ourselves in, kind of a 20-year business cycle that started around 2010, where the kinds of companies that really focused obsessively on understanding and delivering on the needs of their customers, just as customers themselves were getting more demanding, were going to be the kinds of companies that were going to win. And we've got all kinds of good research about that, and we've proved that that is in fact true. But the customer obsession notion was not being paid off in advertising, and who was kind of suffering? Consumers themselves, who were essentially saying, no, I don't like this. This is not working for me. So I wonder if anyone actually gets this reference, if you're old enough and nerdy enough to get this reference. But this was one of my favorite movies when I was 10. And I think it perfectly encapsulates this weird time where we find ourselves, which is the balance being lost has set up this really kind of dramatic, complicated convergence of big forces that are reshaping the world of advertising, really not just today, but like on a go-forward basis. Okay, so when we talk about this idea of data deprecation, what we mean is that the future is going to be one where data itself, consumer data itself, is far less readily available. It's more sparse, it's more heavily controlled, it's more concentrated, and therefore it looks quite different than it has worked in and looked in the last 25 years of digital advertising. So, you know, what are these big forces that are creating all this tumult that I'm talking about? Well, the first is consumers taking privacy protecting actions themselves. We know that the majority of US online adults will tell us that they use at least one kind of privacy or security protecting tool that comes from our technographics data. And then if you ask those folks that use some range of tools, around almost 4 in 10 will say, you know, one of the reasons that they do it is to avoid advertisers getting access to their data. So they are, you know, they are telling us through their behavior that they are not comfortable necessarily with how things are working. Privacy regulations, of course, we've had the GDPR for a while in Europe. Here in the United States, California CCPA and now CPRA, which upped the ante a bit, and lots of other states with sort of similar kinds of initiatives underway that essentially are designed to better inform and protect the consumer and give the consumer significantly more of a voice in the kind of data contract. The third one, which is the one everybody likes to talk about, is the deprecation of the third-party cookie. And of course, that is a very big deal. It's been happening for a while. But when Chrome made the announcement, Google's Chrome made the announcement in January 2020, when everyone threw their hands in the air because Chrome is such a significant player in the browser space, and also Google. But it's not just that, right? You have device manufacturers and OS owners also sort of stepping in and saying, you know, you can't just use data however you want or gather data however you want. So things like mobile ad ID restrictions and the like. And then the fourth, sorry, back to my Clash of the Titans reference. The fourth is that you have these, you know, massive walled gardens, obviously Google, Facebook, and Amazon, but others probably likely to follow who are saying, you know, hey, we have the thing that you want. We have consumers, you know, we know them, we have direct relationships with them, we have lots of data about them and their behaviors, and in some cases their transactions. We have places where we can serve them ads, and we have a means to serve them ads. So if you want to work with us, you got to come to us. And that phenomenon, as I said, is likely to get kind of more pronounced, not less, as more large companies who have those assets recognize that they're in more of a power position than they maybe were pre-data deprecation. So all these forces in a stew, creating a lot of change. So when we think about what this ultimately means, I think it's fair to say that the first 25 years of digital advertising have been relatively wild west. I mean, we've seen, you know, tons and tons of really interesting innovation, tons and proliferation, tons and tons of tools and categories, tons of experimentation, and on one level, you know, theoretically that's a very good thing, and a lot of good has come out of that. But on another, that also means that bad behaviors have been allowed to flourish. We haven't had a really good handle on how to kind of manage all of the complexity, and unintentional consequences have been a byproduct of this sort of unfettered experimentation and innovation, and some shady stuff, quite frankly. So if that was the first 25 years, we're moving now into a model that's going to be significantly more curated, controlled, and managed. And what that ultimately ends up looking like is one where first-party data and second-party data, which are far less scaled than the kind of classic behavioral stuff that's been swirling around, do start to supplant that third-party data ecosystem. Secondarily, you know, the cookie definitely going to die, but what is going to replace it is a hot topic of much debate. The reality is it's not going to be a single thing that replaces it. We're going to have a future that actually is more of a hodgepodge of approaches. And so, for example, the conversation around identity, which by the way is not even a singular concept, but kind of a multifaceted concept, is part of the answer here and part of the equation, but not the only one. We are going to have a real spectrum of addressability, ranging from really addressable, like to the person level, to completely non-existent, no addressability at all. So we don't have a singular future, we have a multifaceted future. And finally, we have to recognize that walls are going to go up and advertisers are going to have to contend with how they want to and are willing to interact with the world in a world with more walls, at minimum with kind of gates around them. So, what to do with all of these forces that are at play, and what to do given some of the new market realities that are presenting themselves. First of all, just remember that all is not lost here. When you ask US online adults, do you think that ads are a good way to learn about new products, for example, 40% will actually agree, only 20% will disagree with that. There's 40% that are neutral, they're on the fence. We have to convince them, and we have to convince them through good and thoughtful behavior. Good and thoughtful behavior follows good and thoughtful strategy. So when I say good and thoughtful strategy, what I don't mean is just go figure out what the next, cookie replacement is going to be and hang your hat on that, because that is not a long-term sustainable solution here. Absolutely not. Instead, it's a bit of a rethink that we need organizations to go through. We really need to treat transparency and choice for consumers as our new default setting. And when we don't have an opportunity to get those things directly, our default setting should be less. We should not have an assumption that we are allowed to get into the lives of every consumer. We also need to focus on value, and it sounds so darn obvious, but I don't think we've necessarily done a very good job of that. Value needs to be defined by what the consumer finds valuable, not necessarily by what we think is right in that moment. And that is going to take some experimentation and trial and error, but it means really committing to trying to understand, if I'm asking something of you, like sharing data with me, why should you? What are you getting in return that is going to be valuable enough to you that you're going to want to take that action with me as a brand? And then the third one is this idea of developing appropriate relationships across the stages of the customer life cycle, which is to say, let's stop defaulting to a place of just because I can, I definitely will, when it comes to things like audience targeting and ad personalization, and appreciate that if you don't have a relationship with someone, such as in a prospecting situation, it may be perfectly acceptable to think about using kind of more traditional style tactics like contextual targeting or other non-audience-based signals or segmentation style approaches with far less personalization in the advertising, because that's appropriate given the kind of lack of connection that you actually have with that consumer. But as you get to know that consumer better and you develop that relationship, you have an opportunity to find out how tailored does this consumer want his or her advertising to be, how much does this consumer want to kind of get closer to me as a brand, and if it's important to me that they do want that, how do I create value creating experiences that are going to incentivize them to want to get closer to me? Because too much too soon is a thing. Nobody wants to be stalked around the internet, but too little too late is also a thing. I'm a new Simply Safe customer. I signed up, I gave them my email address. I have an app, they obviously know who I am, and yet I'm still getting ads that say, hey, sign up for Simply Safe. And I'm just like, guys, I mean, you're a technology company. Like, how do you not know that I'm already a customer? Why don't you give me something that's useful to me as an existing customer? So listen, mastering omnichannel is not a simple thing. And as I said, this is what we are here to talk about today, omnichannel advertising. It takes a real commitment, and it takes a commitment across many, many dimensions. I'm naming them here. These are from our omnichannel advertising playbook, which is also where that TEI model was. But it's everything from kind of people, how you hire people and train people to think and operate this way, to kind of processes that are designed to better connect channels and experiences together, to how you construct the components of your advertising technology stack, to how you think about oversight kind of within and across everything, things like brand safety and suitability, to how you measure bottoms up and top down. But again, all of that to follow good, thoughtful strategy where you're putting consumers and kind of their needs and wants and an appreciation for and respect for their choice kind of front and center. Because even in a data deprecated world, the fundamentals of developing a more omnichannel approach remain true. And we did a bunch of research on this. My colleague Jim Nail and I did a kind of a roadmap report that looked at these kind of stages of maturity when it comes to omnichannel advertising. And again, even if we're not talking about perfect one-to-one addressability, that should not make us throw up our hands and say, well, forget it, I'm not going to try. It's really, again, about a reframing. So when you are early in your omnichannel journey, it's still appropriate to think, how do I create more connected experiences, even across just a couple of channels that don't necessarily have to be perfectly one-to-one, but at minimum feel as though they are referential to one another. What is the impact of my display advertising on my search advertising, for example? What happens when I run a huge television campaign? Does that actually drive conversions in another channel? When you get to the place where you're really running from an omnichannel advertising standpoint, that is when you have this kind of seamless, fast-moving, iterative, nimble kind of approach. And also, I think where you're really pushing industry norms. You're leading the conversation about what the future of advertising should look like. You're testing into alpha and beta opportunities rather than simply saying, I'm going to wait for somebody else to figure it out. Because right now we are building the plane while we are flying it. But what's so important here is that we don't treat this as an opportunity simply to do a find replace on traditional strategies or tactics or technologies, but as a way to build, maybe a rocket ship rather than just building yet another plane. So what are you going to do in the meantime, to get prepared for the data deprecation stuff that's on the horizon? Think about your exposure to things like first, second, and third party data when it comes to your audience segmentation. Think about how your media is being targeted against individual audiences, for example, or individual users. Think about how your programmatic media is working. Are you primarily in open RTB? Are you buying in private marketplaces, programmatic guaranteed, and the like? Take a look at your ad personalization. Do you just have a default setting called DCO retargeting? And is that going to work going forward? And think about your measurement. Bottoms up multi-touch attribution using third-party cookies is in trouble. There are alternative solutions, but it's hard to know with any of these things what you should try if you don't know what your current state looks like. So finally, you have an opportunity here, as I said, to really do a rethink. So what does it mean to rewrite your data strategy with a consumer first lens? Hopefully at this point I've given you a sense of some of the things that you need to be thinking about to do that effectively and thoughtfully so that you're doing it in a way that is sustainable. But appreciate that, you also need to be asking lots of hard questions, not just of kind of how things are working internally inside your organization and, what you're buying and how you're personalizing, but having conversations with the folks in your technology stack to see how they are thinking about data deprecation and whether or not you think that those answers really pass a sniff test when it comes to sort of privacy and sustainable approaches to ethical use of consumer data. I think you should do the same thing with your service providers. Talk to your agency or agencies and do it now. I think some of them are going to have really thoughtful answers that are approaching the philosophical here, and some are just going to say, "Oh, don't worry, we're just going to, identity is the solution." It's just not a thoughtful answer. And you have a real opportunity right now to start testing and benchmarking, and I would love to see folks be doing that more. Like, what is your roadmap for trying alternative methods of targeting, for example, contextual, and that's just one example. Can you start targeting against a sort of more segment or cohort style? Again, how much are you doing on a one-to-one basis? Is it really necessary? What happens if you stop doing that? What happens to performance? Those kinds of things are the questions you should be asking yourself now. Okay, whew. I know that's a lot of territory to cover and not a lot of time, but I hope I have given you, some really useful food for thought here, that we are at a really important and pivotal moment in the future of omnichannel advertising, and that taking a more omnichannel approach does not have to mean this ongoing obsession with perfect one-to-one. It really is about having a mindset around delivering experiences for consumers that are ultimately value creating for those consumers, so that this notion of people hating advertising, this conventional wisdom, can truly prove itself just to be that, conventional wisdom. So with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody's attention. And again, thank you to Mediation for having me.